Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on Catholicism and the history of the United States. We pick up where we left off last time with the Jesuit North American martyrs in the 1640s. The steady depletion of the Canadian Algonquin population by European diseases, coupled with British instigation among the Iroquois, led to the Beaver Wars from 1645 to 1649. And this refers to control over the trade in pelts, animal pelts. The result of these the wars were the virtual extermination of the Algonquins, especially the constituent, the Hurons, as a viable tribe. It was in this context that the Jesuit North American martyrs were captured by Iroquois and treated as enemies because they were French. The tortures they endured were unspeakable. René Goupil was martyred in 1642. Isaac Jogues and Jean de Lalande in 1646. They were all martyred in what is now upstate New York at Ossonon. And there's a monument up there. The rest were martyred in Ontario: Antoine Daniel, Jean de Brebeuf, Gabriel Lalemant, Charles Granier, Noel Chabanel, were all in Ontario. One example is Isaac Jogues. Isaac Jogues and Charles Raimbault were the first Europeans to penetrate as far as Sault Ste. Marie on Lake Superior, where they preached to the indigenous people first in October of 1641. They traveled to Quebec, then moved west. Jogues was captured by Mohawk Indians in August of 1642. He was kept for torture over a year in their village at Ossonon, near present Orisville, New York. The Dutch secured his release and brought him to New York, making him the first Catholic priest to visit the future city of New York. The Dutch put him on a ship back to France. Yet, in the spring of 1644, Isaac Jogues returned to the New World to continue the same mission of preaching to the indigenous tribes in Canada. In the autumn of 1646, he was captured by Iroquois, brought back to Ossonon, where he was tortured more, and finally died on the 18th of October, 1646. Jerome Lalemant, another Jesuit, sent an account of his suffering to the Jesuit superior in 1647. So here's a summary of the situation, the kind of, with the North American, the Jesuits, what they dealt with. This is from the Jesuit Relations, and I know that it sounds odd, and relatio just means like a summary. Reports. There were reports, a summary of the reports that Jesuits sent. Jesuits in the field sent to their superior in Canada, and then those got sent to France, those got sent to Rome, and they were later collected and published into a huge multi-volume, I think it's up to 70 volumes, series, and they really are priceless historical resource. So here's a summary just an excerpt. You get a sense of what the missionary Catholic missions at the time were like. Quote, the 24th of September of last year. So this is being written in 1647, but it's about 1646. Father Isaac Jogues left Three Rivers in order to go to the country of Agneron, Iroquois. That's New York, upstate New York, where the Iroquois were, to the end of maintaining the peace which they had so solemnly concluded, and in order to cultivate and augment the seed of the gospel which had begun to cast into that wretched and thankless land. So the peace, this was a temporary truce negotiated, which they had hoped it would end the war, but it didn't, between the Algonquins and the Iroquois over control of the pelt trade with Europeans. Back to the quote. Before he arrived in that country, this people had sent presents to the Iroquois of the upper countries in order strongly to confirm their alliances and to form a conspiracy for the ruin of the French and of their allied tribes, meaning the Hurons specifically and the Algonquins in general. The cause of this treachery proceeds, in my opinion, from their warlike temper, which cannot stay at rest, and from the glory and advantages which they draw from war, and furthermore from their superstition, and from the hatred which the captive Hurons have given them for the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Those captives, having seen us the reproach of their whole country, on account of the contagious and general diseases of which they made us the authors through our prayers, which they call charms, have cast these notions into the mind of the Iroquois, that we carried the demons, and that we and our doctrine tended only to their ruin, insomuch that they accused Father Isaac Jogues on his first journey, after the conclusion of peace, of having concealed some spells in a small chest that he left with his host as a pledge of his return. The father, seeing them disturbed, took that box, opened it before them, and showed them, and left with them everything that was in it. Sickness having fallen upon their bodies after his departure, as we have learned from the savage prisoners who have escaped. And he's using the word savage. I'm sorry, that's not me. That this is the quote from the Jesuit who's making the report. Prisoners who have escaped, and the worms having perhaps damaged their corn, as the letter of the Dutch testifies, these poor blind creatures have believed that the Father had left a demon among them, and that all our discourses and all our instructions aimed only to exterminate them. These are the reasons for which they have resumed the war, insomuch that the good Father Jogues, murdered on the 18th of October, has had the honor to be a symbol of Jesus Christ, being regarded as a man who had the devil with him, and who employed Beelzebub for driving out the demons from their souls and from all their country. They killed at the same time a young man who accompanied him, namely Jean Lalande, a native of the city of Dieppe. Immediately after these murders, of which we had no knowledge until spring, they spread themselves about in various places in order to capture, kill, and massacre as many French, Algonquins, and Hurons as they could. Let us follow them in their raids and mark the times of their attacks and of their chase after men. So then he goes on to summarize, one after another, these capture these hideous, ghoulish tortures. So I'm not going to read all that. To summarize, the wars were devastating to the French colony. as many civilian settlers suffered the same fate as the Jesuits, but the colony was too valuable to France to lose. Ironically, the virtual destruction of the Hurons aided the Jesuit missionaries in the long run because survivors dispersed further west, joining other tribes such as the Ottawa, the Illinois, and the Ohio. They brought knowledge of Christianity with them and remained friendly to the Jesuits, viewing them as fellow victims of the Iroquois. Another ironic twist of fate was that many Huron women were captured and treated as spoils of war by the Iroquois. One of them was taken as a wife by an Iroquois warrior, and by him she gave birth to a daughter who is now Saint Metairie Tekakwitha. So before I read it, I'll excerpt about her life, just to orient ourselves here. So here is present-day Canada, United States. So later we're going to cover around. So this is the St. Lawrence River in Canada. So you follow it down, Quebec, Montreal. They're following the St. Lawrence, and then when they go away from the river, here's the Ottawa. Here's Ottawa, and then further, here's the Great Lakes. They go here. And so later, when we cover the Acadians, the ancestors of the Cajuns, is going to this border. Well, that was disputed. So I mean, now it's the state of Maine, but it was disputed at the time. And on the other side here, New Brunswick, that's the English, what they call it. But this was Acadia and further up there. And then here's New York, upstate New York. Which at the time in the 1640s was still a Dutch colony. Manhattan is a Dutch name. It was the whole colony was New Amsterdam until the English took it away from them. And here's New York City. So that's where Manhattan is part of New York City. It's an island, New York City, and that was New Amsterdam. And over here is the Mississippi River. When we'll get to another Jesuit, Jacques Marquette, who was the first European to explore it from that direction, to go all the way from the. Well, anyway, we'll get to him. So here is a contemporary account with regard to Saint Metairie from another Jesuit, Pierre Cholenic. He calls her Catherine. And calls her the first Iroquois virgin. Now that obviously but he's speaking, like a dedicated, like one who had dedicated her life to perpetual virginity, to celibacy, lifelong celibacy. That's what he meant. Okay, here's just an excerpt quote. Catherine, as he said, Catherine Tekakwitha is the name of the sainted young woman. Now, when he wrote this in 1696, she wasn't a saint yet, but he's referring, sainted in the small s, in the sense that she's very holy. But now, in retrospect, we know she was actually canonized in 2012. So Catherine is the name of the sainted young woman who I am going to write about, and is today so renowned in New France, that's Canada, because of the extraordinary marvels that God has performed and continues to perform everywhere through her intercession. She was born among the Iroquois in the year 1656, which was a settlement of the lower Iroquois. Her mother was from the Algonquin nation, which had been baptized and raised among the French at Three Rivers. It was there that the Iroquois had taken her, meaning Metairie's mother, from the war with the French, and brought her as a slave to their country. She lived among them, and soon after was married to one of the chiefs of the village. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The girl was called Tekakwitha. It was told of this virtuous woman that she persevered in her faith and the fear of God, and that she had always prayed until her last breath, but she had not the time and consolation to inspire these praiseworthy sentiments in her two children. She had the joy of bringing them into the world and the sorrow of leaving it, because without seeing her desire of them being baptized, smallpox had come among the Iroquois, and a great many of them died from it. She was covered with this common misfortune, and left her two children, who were still very young, and not capable of taking care of themselves. She had prayed to him who was their Creator, so he could also be their Father, and take them under his divine protection. We saw in Tekakwitha that God had heard such a prayer. Her brother had died from the same illness a little while after his mother. Tekakwitha caught also this disease, but our Lord had chosen her to be his bride one day and saved her from death, which in her, that the marvels of his grace might shine forth. She had remained very weak for the rest of her life. Her eyes were affected by the smallpox, and because of this she was not able to endure the great light of day. She was obliged during her entire life to cover her head with a blanket when she left her longhouse, which is like as she is depicted on her images. This was unlike other native girls who would wear blankets on their shoulders. We do not know of the destiny of her father, but we know only that Tekakwitha was an orphan at the age of 4 years old, and lived with her uncle, who was one of the most considered elders of the village. Her aunts had taken all the more care of her, because they had hoped to have benefit from her in the future, and succeeded in giving her a good education. The child had a strong desire, a strong good disposition. She was gentle as she grew in years, and visibly in goodness, that all her inclinations led to virtue. God wanted her for himself. He had early inspired her with the love of work and of solitude. It could be said that these two inclinations were the sources of the innocent life that she led in the country of the Iroquois. When she was a little older, which she was always at work in her longhouse, she gave her aunt all the services that she was capable of doing. She went out in public only when she had some purpose to accomplish. She was always occupied in her longhouse, where she spent some of the time making little articles from the extraordinary skills she possessed. She grinded the corn, went in search of water, carried wood, because these were the ordinary work of her gender among the Iroquois. She avoided idleness, which is so common among the girls, and the source of infinite vice. She would avoid visiting other girls, which was the custom of the young Iroquois, and what was still more admirable in her was the natural horror of all that was against purity. This horror had her leave any sort of gathering or assembly, and led her to avoid dressing as the other native girls because of her sight. She had allowed herself to be led from her aunts, and with the only purpose of obeying and pleasing them. After, she would regard this compliance as one of the greatest sins of her life, and she had made of it a motive for shame and repented it with tears. This same horror of impurity, and the love that she felt inside of her for chastity, without then knowing its merit, had made her refuse marriage when she was of a marriageable age. This young Iroquois had inclinations very much opposed to the purposes of her aunts. When her aunts had wanted her to oblige them by marriage, she would excuse herself by affirming above all her extreme youth, and the little inclination to enter into marriage. The aunts had seemed to approve of these reasons, but later that they resolved again to betroth her when she had least expected. It was not to allow her a choice of the person to whom she was to be united. Accordingly, they cast their eyes upon a young man whose alliance appeared desirable, and they had the proposition to him and the members of the family. The matter had been settled on the two sides, and in the evening the young man entered the longhouse, which was destined for him, and seated next to her. Tekakwitha had appeared disconcerted when she saw the young man seated next to her side. Then, rising abruptly, she left the longhouse without returning until the young man left. This firmness outraged her relatives, and she was to compensate dearly for what she had done, because her aunts had looked upon this as an unbearable stubbornness and inconceivable among the Iroquois. And from this time that she had a great deal to suffer in her longhouse, where she was no longer looked upon as a child of the longhouse, but as a mistreated slave that they had refused and treated with severity at every opportunity. However, she behaved with such patience and of such gentleness in the midst of these rejections and bad treatments, because she had a respectful regard for her aunts and all other matters. She soon regained their affection. They had spoken no more to her of marriage, and let her live in peace within her own manner without further troubling her. Tekakwitha had always resisted with great determination, and from a particular grace of our Lord, which he without any doubt watched over the purity of his future spouse. God had turned this small persecution to good for his faithful servant, and prepared her to receive holy baptism. This was the greatest of all graces, and the only thing absent to have made her a holy girl, and to give the final perfection for the many natural good qualities that shone forth through her. So her 2 years of life, consisted largely of suffering, lost her parents to the smallpox, she was disfigured, but as the account Father Pierre said, she developed great skill working with her hands. She had heard of Christianity from her mother, but it was not until she learned of Jesuit missionaries across a river where the tribes were gathering food that she made a decision. And she crossed the river clandestinely and went to the Jesuits and spent the rest of her life there as an exile. She was not really trusted by the Hurons who were with the Jesuits because her father was Iroquois, and she was not able to return to the Iroquois because she had defected in her mind to the Jesuits, but from the perspective of the Iroquois, she was going back to the Hurons, back to her mother's people. So they considered her a traitor. She, as a result, her time and effort for the rest of her life was devoted to serving the Jesuit missionaries, so that the Jesuits became like her new tribe. She contracted tuberculosis and died in great pain at the age of 24. In the year 1649, the year of the last Jesuit North American martyrs in the Canada-New York area, the situation for Catholicism back in England, in English-controlled America, became far more dangerous, owing to a historic transition that occurred in England. Which brings us to the reign of Charles I. We first met him when we covered the life of George Calvert and his son and grandson. So now we revisit King Charles I of England in a different context. We catch him later in his life. Charles I was a Stuart monarch, the Stuart dynasty, reigning over Scotland and England beginning in 1625. And that's where we last met him. His personal tendencies in regard to religion were high church Anglican. This resulted in Calvinist Puritans in England labeling him as popish, meaning, excessively influenced by Catholicism. Complicated by his marriage to the Catholic princess, French Catholic princess Henriette Marie. Charles attempted to impose high church Anglican ceremonial and episcopacy onto Scotland, which was Presbyterian, meaning that they rejected all, holy orders, priesthood, bishops, all that. And that attempt formed the basis for a common cause between Scottish Presbyterians and English Puritans that led to civil war. Charles's hopelessly inept government and military leadership inevitably resulted in his defeat, followed by a drumhead trial, which, of course, condemned him to death. Accounts of the dignity of his final hours leading up to and including his execution on the 30th of January, 1649, led him to being revered as a martyr by high church Anglicans. His defeat was accomplished by a Puritan general named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell turned himself into a dictator after overthrowing the monarchy. Shocking, isn't it? He disbanded Parliament, and he governed England under the title Lord Protector. You like that? Lord Protector. Until his death in 1658. This, the Protectorate of Cromwell, represents the apex of Puritan Calvinist control over English political and social life. The effect on the English colonies in America, on the Atlantic coast, took the form of hostility that we can trace manifested first in Anglican Virginia, in the Virginia colony, against the Maryland colony, because the Maryland colony, you remember from when we talked about the Calverts, tolerated Catholics. Actually, tolerated all religions, but that was to protect Catholics. And that toleration had been present from the beginning, from George Calvert, the first Baron Baltimore. And from the time of, he didn't visit, but from the beginning, the Virginia colonists, Anglicans in Virginia, resented the Calverts in Maryland for this. Anti-Catholic sentiment in England, as a result of the Civil War, escalated such that 11 priests were executed in Virginia in 1641 and 42. And Virginia availed itself of this opportunity of the capture of priests and murder of priests to say, okay, that they're coming. You see the church, the Catholic, you see popery is attempting. You see, we warned you. Popery is attempting to invade and take over. So they avail themselves of this opportunity to pass an act in James City in March of 1642, referring to one of the anti-popery laws from back in the third year of King James I, prohibiting Catholics from holding public office. Catholics who attempted to pass as in order to hold office, meaning clandestine Catholics who were pretending to be Protestant in order to make a living, hold office, were to be fined 1,000 pounds of tobacco. Catholic priests who landed in Virginia ports had to vacate the territory within 5 days, or it would be assumed that they were there for nefarious purposes, and then they were traitors and would be treated accordingly, which means execution. Anti-clerical paranoia, fueled by the catastrophic 30 Years' War in Europe, which is a whole other thing. It was the last of the wars of religion, 30 years murdering each other over, along with the proximity of French Catholics in Nova Scotia and present-day Maine, prompted the Massachusetts colony, further north from Virginia, prompted a reiteration of the anti-popery laws in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Quote, taking into consideration the great wars and combinations which are this day in Europe, and that the same are observed to be chiefly raised and fomented by the secret practices of those in the Jesuitical order. Then it went on and said that the first capture of a Jesuit would be punished by banishment and the second by execution. The Virginia law was in March of 1642. The Massachusetts Bay Law was on May 26, 1647. 2 years later, 21st of April, 1649, in Maryland. So the English Civil War culminated with the execution of Charles I at the beginning of that year, January 30th, 1649. Friendly to Catholics and married to a Catholic, the victor, Oliver Cromwell, was a Calvinist Puritan. So as a result of this ascendancy, waves of Calvinists arrived in the English North American colonies, where they were greeted initially by persecution from loyalist Anglicans in Virginia. So they moved across the border from Virginia to Maryland, which had religious toleration. So the Calvinists were safer in the colony of Maryland than they were in Virginia. But once they got a numerical majority in Maryland, they immediately set about nullifying that toleration, as they wanted to turn Maryland into a Calvinist colony, which would be intolerant of everyone else, including Anglicans, just as the Anglicans in Virginia had been intolerant of them. So you see, people are, the colonists who had been in multi-generational, at least in the second generation in Maryland, recognized what was happening. So they tried to get a step ahead of it. That's the background for a document that's called An Act Concerning Religion, passed by both Catholics as well as moderate Protestants in the Maryland Colonial Assembly. It was in keeping with the policy of the Lords Baltimore from the beginning. It was not a Catholic act specifically, because that wasn't possible in the English system. Rather, it offered toleration specifically in writing, and quote, "No person or persons whatsoever within this province, professing to believe in Jesus Christ, shall from henceforth be in any ways troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province. Anyone who did violate this by antagonizing another person for their religion were to be fined, and if they refused to pay the fine, then they were subject to flogging and imprisonment." This was an attempt to hold on to the toleration of the original Lords Baltimore against the waves of Calvinists. It didn't work. Well, I mean, it worked briefly, but not. So that act was April 21st, 1649. So it lasted 5 years. Oliver Cromwell was the victor in the English Civil War in the same year, established the dictatorship as the Lord Protector. Within that context, a Virginia planter and Protestant colonial leader named William Claiborne picked the right side in the English Civil War. So he rose. He has influence in the new system and under the Protectorate, putting him in a position to lead the Protestant revenge, taking over Virginia from the Church of England and taking over Maryland from the Catholic tolerant leadership. I mean, it was Catholics were never a majority in Maryland in the colonial period, but it was the colony that had the largest number of Catholics, and the Protestants who were in Maryland, some were Quakers or some also valued that toleration until they got outnumbered by the Calvinists, and that it starts here with this guy. So first the Calvinists took Virginia away from the Church of England, from the Anglicans, and then moved to take Maryland away. They did so with an act, another law, disenfranchising Catholics in Maryland, dated October 20th, 1654. This act ended the toleration practiced in Maryland since 1634, and it enshrined in a colonial statute, this disenfranchisement in the following words, quote, "None who profess and exercise the popish religion, commonly known by the name of the Roman Catholic religion, can be protected in this province by the laws of England, but are to be restrained from the exercise thereof," of their religion. So here's an excerpt of a letter from Maryland Jesuits written in 1656 on the, like a ground level view of the Puritan ascendancy, what that meant day to day. And it also explains the otherwise inexplicable. Why so many Catholics, colonial Anglo-Catholics in the colonies, sided with the revolutionaries against the English monarchy. Because you would think, well, why should Catholics side with any of them? I mean, because the colonial authorities treated us like dirt, and then the English, back in England, we were treated like dirt. So why fight for anybody? So this is the reason. It was in hopes of a new government being universally tolerant of religion. So these are the words of the Jesuit, quote, "In Maryland, during the year last past," so that's 1655 he's writing about, but he's writing in 1656, "our people have escaped grievous danger, and have had to contend with great difficulties and straits, and have suffered many unpleasant things, as well from enemies as from our own people. The English, who inhabit Virginia, made an attack on the colonists, themselves Englishmen too, and, safely being guaranteed on certain conditions, received the governor of Maryland, with many others, in surrender. But the conditions being treacherously violated, 4 of the captives, 3 of them Catholics, were pierced with leaden balls." They were shot. "Rushing into our houses, they demanded death for the impostors, as they called them, intending inevitable slaughter to those who should be caught. But the fathers," meaning the Jesuits, "by the protection of God, unknown to them, were carried from before their faces. Their books, furniture, and whatever was in the house fell prey to the robbers. With almost the entire loss of their property, private and domestic, together with great peril of life, they were secretly carried into Virginia, and in the greatest want of necessities, scarcely and with difficulty do they sustain life." So that's written in 1656. In 1660, so Cromwell died in 1658. In 1660, the English in England were had enough of the Puritans, the government. So there was the Restoration, meaning the restoration of the monarchy. They couldn't restore Charles I because they murdered him, so they restored the monarchy in the person of his son, who became King Charles II. He had lived during the Puritan Protectorate in France, where his mother was from. He was restored to the throne of England 2 years after the death of the Lord Protector Cromwell, bringing us to the year 1660. Charles II's religious moderation was welcomed by a population fatigued by the imposed austerity of the Protestant ascendancy, the Puritan ascendancy. He was restored to the throne of England on certain conditions set by Parliament, to which he agreed. After he was on the throne, all legal documents were dated to create the fiction that he succeeded to the throne in 1649 at his father's death. So, trying to legally erase the protectorate. Speaking of whom, the Lord Protector, the corpse of the Lord Protector was disinterred from Westminster Abbey, and the corpse was charged with treason. It was found guilty of treason, and Oliver Cromwell's corpse was executed by hanging at Tyburn. So this is obviously a period of reaction. Extremes always produce each other. The extreme austerity is going to produce, extreme liberality, or, dissipation, as some would say, in the Restoration period. And then, that extreme dissipation, that's going to produce another, back to moral austerity. So that just seems to be the pendulum effect. It just seems to be something that humans can't escape, at least in the aggregate. I mean, individuals might be able to overcome it, but as an aggregate in groups, humans are just subject to the pendulum effect, going one side to the other. So always mistrust extremes. Always. Always, always. In this period of reaction, Anglican episcopacy and priesthood were reestablished in control of the Church of England. Theaters, musical concerts, and taverns were allowed to resume operations. All that had been closed during the Protectorate, during the Calvinist ascendancy. Charles II was the first to permit women to perform on stage. Previously, female roles had been played by boys or young men in disguise, dressed as women. And so they were called the travesti. That's from the Italian meaning in disguise. But now women could play women. Charles II, he did this because he really, really, really liked women. He was a hedonist. He fathered 12 illegitimate children by 7 mistresses. He did have a wife, and she also bore him children, but none of them survived to adulthood. Charles II was a patron of the arts and sciences. He established the Royal Observatory. He endowed the Royal Society. He was also a personal patron of Sir Christopher Wren, the architect who planned the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire that occurred in Charles's reign. It began on September 2nd, 1666, destroying 87 churches and 13,000 other buildings. On his deathbed, Charles II converted. He became Catholic on his deathbed, February 6th, 1685. Since none of his, legitimate children survived him, and the laws of the day precluded an illegitimate child inheriting the crown, then Charles II's heir became his younger brother, who became King James II. The problem to the English Protestants, and this time a problem for both the Anglicans and the Calvinists, was that James II was already Catholic. He also, like his brother Charles, had fled to France, during the Civil War, and was raised. But James had already converted, and it was known. It wasn't a secret. I mean, it was known because France was a Catholic country. So when he was still there, he didn't have to keep it secret. And herein lies what's going to happen to James. Why he's going to end. His monarchy is going to be very brief. But sticking with the chronology, so the Restoration is 1660. 3 years later, in 1663, back in the French, in New France, which is now Canada, a missionary bishop named Laval, Bishop Laval, established a seminary the Seminary of the Foreign Missions, which doubled as his chancery. His purpose in doing this was to train clergy, or train young men to be priests, to work specifically in New France, in Canada, for the particular demands there. Because Laval did not want to be dependent on religious like the Jesuits. He wanted to cultivate, he wanted to have, his own, what we would call diocesan priest. It should be noted that this seminary, the Foreign Missions, trained Frenchmen and Canadian-born, Frenchmen like those born in France who came to Canada for this purpose, as well as those born in Canada but of French blood. It did not. He did not. Bishop Laval did not, and no one at the time considered training any of the indigenous people for the priesthood, since they practiced polygamy, tribally, polygamy. They were deemed by the French hierarchy to be morally incapable of living a celibate life. Now, this was a misunderstanding. Not every Indian engaged in polygamy. It's just the ones they knew, polygamy did exist, but that typically was reserved for the chiefs. It was not a tribal law. Anyone could engage in it, but just by practicalities, the only ones that had the resources to do that, it would be the chiefs. Anyway, the hostility of the bishop to the Jesuits forced the Jesuits to continue moving west from Quebec, and so that's how they explored the Great Lakes. The Jesuits discovered there the descendants of the Huron refugees from the conflicts over the beaver trade, living among the Ottawa and the Illinois tribes, and so that facilitated the Jesuit efforts to convert those tribes. The Illinois consisted of 6 tribes south of Lake Michigan and moved down along the Illinois River. They populated along the Illinois, village settlements. They too had a polygamous social structure. In religion, they were animist, though their chief reverence was for the sun spirit. Others, like the Hurons, it was the earth spirit, and others was the water spirit. And then when they went further, as Father Marquette's going to encounter those, he called the fire tribe, that they reverenced the fire spirit. The pivotal moment in the life of an Illinois was the acquisition of a Manitou, which is a spirit guide. This would take place in a state of altered consciousness called a dream quest, which was facilitated by consumption of hallucinogenic vegetation. Whatever animal appeared to the quester would then be adopted, would then be considered that person's lifelong Manitou. The Jesuits structured these missions with what was called reductions. And this is, I know that word doesn't sound right in English. They were essentially religious colonies that were a combination of church, school, village, and also an economic enterprise. Like they first did this in South America with tea plantations, which was run. They designed it for the tea plantations to be run by the tribe rather than by the Jesuits. So the Jesuits' role would be to facilitate trade because they had the connections and the language skills back to Europe. So the tea produced in South America, the Jesuits would facilitate the trade, but then the profits would still stay with the tribe. So the Jesuits, by the time they got to Illinois, they saw the fertile soil, well watered, a lot of so they thought that they would try it again. And made it a success. They were a spectacular success among the Illinois. And it was the Illinois who first mentioned to the Jesuits the existence of a river greater than any other river. One intrepid Jesuit decided to find it and explore it, and this is Father Jacques Marquette. He was born in France in 1637, and he came to the colonies as a missionary. They followed the northern shore of Lake Michigan, entered Green Bay, and then followed the Fox and Wisconsin rivers until they entered the Mississippi on June 17th, 1673. Marquette called it the River of the Immaculate Conception. They followed the river down to present-day Rosedale, Mississippi, at which point they realized that it would continue south. They realized that it was the same river that had previously, in the previous century, not the previous. Anyway, so they realized that it would go south to the Gulf of Mexico instead of west as they had thought, and south at this point would have been Spanish territory, and so they were afraid to go down, so they didn't go any farther than Rosedale, Mississippi. Marquette returned to the northern missions, where he died of a fever in 1675 on May 18th. So I have two things. One is a letter, a description from a Jesuit at the time named Father Claude Dablon. He was the superior of the Jesuit missions in Canada. And what I'm going to read from is what he wrote. He wrote back to the Jesuit provincial in France. And then I'm going to read a section of what Father Marquette himself wrote about it. So this is first from Father Claude, dated October 24th, 1674. Quote, "The Father," that's Marquette, "had long premeditated this undertaking, influenced by a most ardent desire to extend the kingdom of Jesus Christ and to make him known and adored by all the peoples of that country. He saw himself, as it were, at the door of these new nations, when, as early as the year 1670, he was laboring in the mission at the point of the Holy Spirit, at the extremity of Lake Superior. He even saw occasionally various persons bringing to these new peoples, from whom he obtained all the information he could. This induced him to make several efforts to commence this undertaking, but ever in vain. And he even lost all hope of succeeding, when God brought about for him the following opportunity. In the year 1673, Monsieur le Comte de Frontenac, that's the French governor of New France of Canada, and Monsieur Talon, our intendant, recognizing the importance such a discovery would represent, either that they might seek a passage from here to the Sea of China, so still the Northwest Passage they're looking for, by the river that discharges into the Vermilion Sea or the California Sea. So they were still thinking that that's, ultimately it is, if you make it to California, but they're still looking for a Northwest Passage. Or because they desire to verify what has for some time been said concerning the two kingdoms which border on Canada, in which numerous gold mines are reported to exist. These gentlemen, I say, appointed at the same time for this undertaking Sieur Joliet, this is Louis Joliet, whom they considered very fit for so great an enterprise, and they were well pleased that Father Marquette should be of the party. So Joliet was a layman, but he had studied under the Jesuits. He had studied at a Jesuit school. And he was a coureur de bois, runner in the woods. He was, like a ranger, so to speak, for you Lord of the Ring fans. So he would function as the guide, and Marquette would go along. Although Joliet, he he didn't know where the Mississippi was, but he had traveled more among the Indians and the waterways than Marquette had. So he was a few steps ahead. Plus, he had he had acquired more of the particular languages, at least at an argot level, with the other tribes. They were not mistaken in the choice they made of Joliet, for he is a young man born in this country, meaning Canada, who possesses all the qualifications that could be desired for such an undertaking. He has experience, he knows the languages spoken in the country where he has passed several years. He possesses tact and prudence, which are the chief qualities necessary for the success of a voyage as dangerous as it is difficult. Finally, he has the courage to dread nothing where everything is to be feared. Consequently, he has fulfilled all the expectations entertained of him. And if, after having passed through 1,000 dangers, he had not unfortunately been wrecked in the very harbor, his canoe having upset below near Montreal, where he lost both his men and his papers, and whence he escaped only by a sort of miracle, nothing would have been left to be desired in the success of his voyage. Okay, now he goes on and on, but you get the point. That's how it began. The Jesuit was talking to the governor, said, we hear there's huge rivers over there. The governor said maybe it's the Northwest Passage, so I want somebody to explore it. Well, I know this guy Joliet, and then the Jesuit said, well, send one of my guys, Father Marquette. So anyway, that's the point of reading that. So now, what did Marquette say for himself? This is just an excerpt, quote, "The feast of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin, whom I have always invoked, since I have been in this country, to obtain from God the grace of being able to visit the nations who dwell along the Mississippi River, was precisely the day on which Monsieur Joliet arrived with orders from Monsieur le Count de Frontenac, our governor, to accomplish this discovery with me. I was all the more delighted at this good news, since I saw that my plans were about to be accomplished, and since I found myself in the blessed necessity of exposing my life for the salvation of these people, and especially of the Illinois, who have very urgently entreated me, when I was at the point of Saint-Esprit, to carry the word of God to their country. We were not long in preparing all our equipment, although we were about to begin a voyage, the duration of which we could not foresee. Indian corn with some smoked meat constituted all our provisions. With these we embarked, Monsieur Joliet and myself, with 5 men, in 2 bark canoes, fully resolved to do and suffer everything for so glorious an undertaking. Accordingly, on the 17th of May, 1673, we started from the mission of St. Ignace in Michilimackinac, where I then was. The joy that we felt at being selected for this expedition animated our courage, and rendered the labor of paddling from morning to night agreeable to us. And because we were going to seek unknown countries, we took every precaution in our power, so that if our undertaking were hazardous, it should not be foolhardy. To that end, we obtained all the information we could from the savages, and again, I'm sorry, that's just the way they refer to them in the text, who had frequented those regions, and we even traced out from their reports a map of the whole of that new country. On it we indicated the rivers which we were to navigate, the names of the peoples and the places through which we were to pass, the course of the great river, and the direction we were to follow when we reached it. Above all, I placed our voyage under the protection of the Blessed Virgin Immaculate, promising her that if she granted us the favor of discovering the great river, I would give it the name of the Conception, and that I would also make the first mission that I should establish among those new peoples bear the same name. This I have actually done among the Illinois. And so he did, and the Jesuits, before it became part of the United States, which of course then the United States is not going to call the Mississippi the River of the Immaculate Conception, but Marquette did name it that, the River of the Immaculate Conception. So skipping down. Here we are at Mascoutins. This word may in Algonquin mean the Fire Nation, which indeed is the name given to this tribe. Here is the limit of the discoveries which the French have thus far made, for they have not yet gone any farther. So the Fire Nation, if any of you catch the reference, any of you, sci-fi fans, that, well, not sci-fi so much, I guess, would be. Anyway, if you catch the reference, email or post below the video. This village consists of 3 nations who have gathered here, the Miamis, the Mascoutins, and the Kickaboos. No sooner had we arrived than we, Monsieur Joliet and I, assembled the elders together, and he told them that he was sent by Monsieur our governor to discover new countries, while I was sent by God to illumine them with the light of the Holy Gospel. He told them that, moreover, the sovereign master of our lives wished to be known by all the nations, and that in obeying his will, I feared not the death to which I exposed myself in voyages so perilous. He informed them that we needed 2 guides to show us the way, and we gave them a present, by it asking them to grant us the guides. To this they consented, and they also spoke to us by means of a present, consisting of a mat to serve as a bed during our whole voyage. On the following day, the 10th of June, 2 Miamis, who were given us as guides, embarked with us, in the sight of a great crowd, who could not sufficiently express their astonishment at the sight of 7 Frenchmen, alone in 2 canoes, daring to undertake so extraordinary and so hazardous an expedition. We knew that, at 3 leagues from Mascoutins, was a river which discharged into the Mississippi. We knew also that the direction we were to follow in order to reach it was west-southwest. But the road is broken by so many swamps and small lakes that it is easy to lose one's way, especially as the river leading thither is so full of wild oats that it is difficult to find the channel. For this reason, we greatly needed our 2 guides, who safely conducted us to a portage of 2,700 paces, and helped us to transport our canoes to enter that river, after which they returned home, leaving us alone in this unknown country in the hands of Providence. Thus we left the waters, flowing to Quebec, 400 or 500 leagues from here, to float on those that would thenceforward take us through strange lands. Before embarking thereon, we began all together a new devotion to the Blessed Virgin Immaculate, which we practiced daily, addressing to her special prayers to place under her protection both our persons and the success of our voyage. And after mutually encouraging one another, we entered our canoes. The river on which we embarked is called Muskegon's. It is very wide. It has a sandy bottom. It goes down, and then he goes on describing it. Our route lay southward. After navigating about 30 leagues, we saw a spot presenting all the appearances of an iron mine. And in fact, one of our party, who had formerly seen such mines, assures us that the one which we found is very good and very rich. It is covered with 3 feet of good soil, and is quite near a chain of rocks, the base of which is covered by very fine trees. And proceeding 40 leagues on this same route, we arrived at the mouth of our river, and at 42.5 degrees latitude, we safely entered the Mississippi River, the River of the Immaculate Conception, on the 17th of June, with a joy that I cannot express. Here we are, then, on this so renowned river, all of whose peculiar features I have endeavored to note carefully. The Mississippi River takes its rise in various lakes in the country of the northern nations. And then he goes on and describes it. But its origin is Lake Itasca in Minnesota. So he goes on to describe it. But that's it. That's history. First European to discover the Mississippi. That was in 1673. The next year, October 1st, 1674, New France, or Canada, received a regular ecclesiastical hierarchy when the Vicariate Apostolic of New France was elevated to the status of an ordinary diocese under the Bishop of Quebec. That diocese was considered a suffragan of the Archdiocese of Rouen, France. Just as when we talked about the Spanish, that the bishops in the Spanish colonies were considered suffragan bishops of the Archdiocese of Seville in Spain. So neither one, France or Spain, are allowing the church to do it properly. So they should be, the missionary bishops should be auxiliary bishops of the Diocese of Rome. But just as we covered with the Spanish, the monarchs did not want to surrender that control. They wanted the church dependent on French ships, on French troops for transport, on resources, just as the Spanish did. So that's going to limit the autonomy that the French clergy would have in dealing with the indigenous people in New France and later Louisiana, just as it did with the Spanish, with the Spanish clergy dealing with the imposition, with the Atlantic slave trade, with bringing the slaves to the New World. Speaking of Spain, the Queen Mother of Spain, Maria Ana, she was the mother of Carlos II. He was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. He is remembered for his physical disabilities, which were the result of inbreeding. So, many of these royal houses, royalty and aristocracy only wanted to marry other royalty and aristocracy. So there are some cases where, genetic inbreeding was not unusual, but there were cases where it became so extreme that some really unfortunate effects occurred, that children were really born with some serious consequences, and this guy was one. In his case, it was the jaw. I don't want to get into too much trouble, but he suffered for it, and so he died. Now he couldn't have children. Was another. So he died childless in 1700, with no other immediate Habsburg heir. His will envisioned this. He knew that was, he knew it named as his successor a 16-year-old named Philippe Philip of Anjou, who was a grandson of King Louis XIV of France and Charles's half-sister, Maria. So that would be from her would be the connection to his dynasty, but then she, since she was female, it was the male who would establish the new dynasty, and he's French. Disputes over this inheritance led to the War of the Spanish Succession, which we'll cover in due course. I'm talking about this now, just mention him now, because of the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria. She was married to the Spanish king, Philippe IV. He died in 1665. She was then regent for her son, who was 3 years old, Carlos II. And due to his ill health, she essentially remained, de facto governed ruler of Spain until her own death in 1696. And then her son, Carlos II, died 4 years later in 1700. So a guy named Calderon, Bishop Calderon of Santiago, he became Bishop of Santiago in Cuba in 1671. At that point, his name was Gabriel Diaz. Gabriel Diaz Vara y Calderon, or Calderon, I guess. At that point, no bishop had visited Spanish Florida in 60 years. So he just figured, he had to do it. So he sailed from Havana on August 18, 1674, landed in St. Augustine, Florida on August 23rd. He wrote back to the Queen Mother, functionally the Queen, in her capacity as regent for Carlos II, about the conditions he found. And he did this on May 4th, 1673. That's the date of the letter, his report that he wrote back to her. And it's a snapshot of Spanish missions in Florida, which is why I'm talking about this now. He found there 300 Spanish inhabitants in St. Augustine. He described the climate as unhealthful, being cold in winter with freezes, and excessively hot in summer. There was a parish church there dedicated to St. Augustine. He noted that it had a priest, a sacristan, and did have acolytes. He just used the word plural for that, but didn't enumerate further. There was present a Franciscan convent, headquarters for the province of Santa Elena. 3 Franciscan friars were there, a superior, a preacher, and a lay brother. Plus they had 3 curates, is the word he used, for the 3, that would just mean friars who were priests, another 3 friars who were priests. Each one, the appointed chaplain, so to speak, of the 3 different tribes that were in the vicinity, the Guale, the Timucua, and the Apalachee. Not Apache, Apalachee, there's 2 different things. It had a hospital with 6 beds called Our Lady of Solitude. The Franciscans had a mission among the Guale called the Name of God, the Nombre de Dios. It had 30 baptized Indians as part of the parish. It also, the Franciscans had 11 missions among the Timucua and 13 among the Apalachee. They had 2 more missions he mentioned. He said there were around 4,000 Indians who frequented the missions, but did not get baptized, because the missions were sources of, they had food there, they had shelter, education, and the friars provided this and preached, and hoped over time that they would get some more converts. He claimed that in the entire peninsula of Florida, there were 13,152 indigenous people who had been baptized. The fortress in St. Augustine had 20 cannons, a governor, and 305 troops. In 1675, Florida saw its first ordinations to the priesthood, when 7 they were called criollos, Criollo. These are people of Spanish blood, Spanish ancestry, but born in the colony. So 7 of those, 7 criollos, were ordained Franciscan priests. By this point, in 1675, 1/3 of the 80 Franciscans in the Florida missions were criollos, meaning Spanish blood, but born in the colony. The other 2/3 had been ordained in Europe and sent, ordained in either Spain or most of Spain, and then came to the colony. So Calderon became Bishop of Cuba in 1671. His jurisdiction included Florida. All right. He commented, his words, quote, this is the Apalachee, but I think it was referring to a particular, he administered confirmation to 152 Christianized Indians who had already been baptized, but not confirmed. And in the course of that, he's describing that, so these are his words, quote, "They are clever and quick to learn any art they see done, are great carpenters, as is evidenced by their construction of their wooden churches. They fight with bow and arrow, and a hatchet called a macana. These Indians do not covet riches, nor do they esteem gold, coins of which do not even circulate among them. And their only barter is the exchange of one commodity for another, which exchange they call rescate. As to religion, they are not idolaters, and they embrace with devotion the mysteries of the holy faith." So that meaning, when he said they were animists, that's as opposed to idolaters, like they worshipped at rivers, trees, waterfalls, rocks, animal spirits. But when he says they're not idolaters, I mean, he means that they did not carve statues of idols. Like they didn't try to carve a statue of the goddess of the river. They might worship the river. That's what animists would do, but not. So that's what he meant. Mass was held in the mission at 11 o'clock on Sundays and holy days. They bring to church a log of wood for the priest as a donation. They do not talk in church. He admired that they were disciplined. The genders sat separately. Women sat on the epistle side, men sat on the gospel side. So they had quite a devotion to Our Lady. He had attended a mass for her on Saturday, a special mass on Saturday. Sunday afternoon, they say the Rosary, and they conclude by singing the Rosary ends with this, but they would sing the Salve Regina. On Christmas, they did celebrate Midnight Mass, and they had penance during Holy Week. They, during the Triduum, the Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, they rotated saying the Rosary all 3 days, all 72 hours, 24 men and 24 women. And they just kept saying it, continuously. In another part of Spanish America, Texas, we find an account from the 16th of May, 1675, of the first Mass celebrated within the borders of what is now Texas. This was in the context of an attempt to preach to the Indians north of the Rio Grande, beginning that year, led by Franciscans. The leader of the expedition was a friar, Juan Larios, Larios. Another Spaniard, Fernando del Bosque, Bosque, left an account of a high mass, as he described it, a high mass celebrated on the 16th of May, 1675, at a place he called San Isidro. Larios was the celebrant of the Mass. After Mass, he baptized 55 infants of the local tribe, with Spaniards acting as godfathers. They had no women in the expedition with them, so it was all men. He identified the people of 4 different people, tribes, 4 chiefs. So from that he deduced there were 4 tribes, who led 425 warriors, who had 747 women, and total, adding children, 1,172 at the Mass, at this first high Mass that was celebrated. Outdoors, of course, but 7 years later, the French claim the entire Mississippi River. It took almost a decade after Marquette for anyone else to try to complete his quest of tracing the entire length of the river, the Immaculate Conception, down to its mouth. In 1682, René Robert de La Salle sailed all the way down the river to the mouth of what is now called the Mississippi. And when he got there to the mouth, he claimed everything drained, the entire Mississippi River Valley, for France on the 9th of April, 1682. This region would be under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Diocese of Quebec, which means the Archdiocese of Rouen, for the remainder of the French colonial period. The following year, October 31st, 1683, New York, the colony of New York, made a grant of religious toleration. We've already seen that Maryland was the first English colony to have a Catholic governor, the Calverts. New York was the second. Which brings us back to James II, King of England, the Catholic King of England. In 1682, James, this is before he became king, he was still the Catholic Duke of York, appointed a Catholic named Thomas Dongan, Dongan, as governor of New York. So it happened like this. Thomas Dongan was born in Ireland, County Kildare, Ireland, in 1634. His father John was a baronet and a member of the Irish Parliament. One of his uncles, Sir Robert, married one of the Calvert girls, Grace. He married Grace Calvert. During the English Civil War, Sir Robert, the Dongans sided, they were royalists, so they sided with Charles I, meaning after he was executed, they fled to France in 1649, along with Charles's widow, Henriette Marie, and her children. Those children included the future Charles II and the future James II. The latter, James, converted to Catholicism and entered French service as an army officer, in the course of which he met and befriended Thomas Dongan, who chose the same occupation, to the army, professional soldier. After the restoration of the Stuarts in 1660, in the person of Charles II, younger brother James became Duke of York. He took his friend and fellow soldier, Thomas Dongan, with him in his personal service. In 1664, during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, Duke James, with Thomas Dongan, led an attack on New Amsterdam in the Hudson River, which is now Manhattan. And that ended in English control of the region. The English won the war. So older brother Charles II, king, rewarded James with the colony and renamed it from New Amsterdam to New York in James's honor, the Duke of York. Like Cecil Calvert, whom we talked about previously, James had no intention of actually living in New York, so he appointed Dongan as its first English governor. Even though Charles II did not convert to Catholicism until his deathbed, the anti-popery laws were still in effect, but they were not enforced during Charles II's reign because he was more laid back. So Dongan's Catholicism was politely ignored, as was the Catholicism for Duke James of York, for that matter. As governor, Dongan convened the first representative assembly of New York Province, which later became the state, on October 14th, 1683. It met at what was at Fort James, within the present boundaries of the city of New York. This assembly, under the supervision of Dongan, passed the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, including the following statement, quote, that no person or persons which profess faith in God by Jesus Christ shall at any time be in any ways molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any difference in opinion or matter of religion who do not actually disturb the civil peace of the province. On other matters, this charter decreed that the supreme legislative power under the Duke of York resided in a governor, the council, and the people convened in a general assembly. It established this assembly as a body equal to and independent of the British Parliament. It established town, county, and general courts of justice. It clarified certain liberties, including no taxation without representation. Taxes could be levied only by the people who met in General Assembly. The right of suffrage, meaning the right to vote. There would be no martial law or quartering of soldiers in private homes without the consent of the inhabitants. Election took place by a majority, simple majority, 50% plus 50 plus 1. And it appropriated the English law of real property, or real estate. These characteristics, these liberties, went well beyond the English Magna Carta and are strikingly similar to later constitutional philosophy of our founding fathers. Hence, it is to the Catholic Governor Thomas Dongan, that can be dated the prototype for American constitutional government. When the British government revoked these rights, his system became the program of political agitation by the colonists of New York Province during the 18th century. It developed naturally into the present state government, and many of its principles passed into the framework of the federal government, which we still live under. In 1688, King James II was overthrown in what English history books call the Glorious Revolution. He was overthrown for the unforgivable crime of Catholicism, and for having children, suggesting the possibility of an enduring Catholic dynasty reigning over England. Governor Dongan, of course, lost his position as governor once James was overthrown. He returned to Europe when James made an attempt to regain the throne and failed. Dongan's brother and his nephew both died fighting for James at the Battle of the Boyne River in 1690, and the battle was lost. James then fled back to France, obliged to live off the charity of the French for the rest of his life. Thomas Dongan died alone and penniless, but the work of this Catholic in New York established a legal and philosophical legacy that endures to this day, even though his name, has largely been lost. 1685, so now we get back to James. 1685, Charles II of England died, converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, followed by James II. Okay. James was already Catholic, and he wished to moderate the conditions under which Catholics had to live. So in 1687, he did something to that end, which is what set in motion his removal. In 1687, he issued a declaration of indulgence as a royal edict. This granted religious toleration in England, with the aim of ultimately removing the legal disabilities of the anti-popery laws as they had been applied to Catholics since Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth I. James's attempt to have the anti-popery laws repealed triggered the Glorious Revolution. It united against him the Anglican establishment, which did not want to lose the privileged status they had of being the established church, united them with the Calvinists, who regarded Catholics as the spawn of Satan, as the beast, the whore of Babylon. Normally, the Anglicans and Calvinists, as we've seen, had an adversarial relationship, but both could unite in their hatred of Catholicism and their fear of Catholicism. So that's how the revolution, and the reason they call it the Glorious Revolution is that it was bloodless, because nobody would fight for James, at least nobody on sight. So he had to flee, then he gathered supporters, people like Dongan came back and tried to retake England, but there weren't enough people to fight for him to make it possible. He was overthrown in 1688. So what happened to England then? James's eldest daughter, Mary, was married to a militant Dutch Protestant, and Dutch Protestantism is Calvinist. His name was William, of the House of Orange-Nassau. Protestant opponents of James encouraged William to invade England, to press a claim on the throne on behalf of his wife, for the purpose of rescuing them, from a Catholic takeover. William only agreed on condition that he was given the title of king, not prince consort. So that's like the current English monarch is Elizabeth II. She's the one who actually inherited the crown. Her spouse, Philip, was not given the crown matrimonial. He was just made a crown prince. He was not made king. William wouldn't go for that. He said, I want to be made king, and if my wife predeceases me, I want to remain king until my death. After that, the children I have with the queen can inherit. And because they needed him, Parliament accepted. And it did, in fact, his wife did die before him, and he did remain king. So they agreed. James, abandoned by virtually everyone, fled the country, settled in France. So this is William and Mary of Orange. William III and Mary II ruled jointly after the Revolution in 1688. This victory of militant anti-Catholics meant the final end of George Calvert's dreams for Maryland. This revolution was paralleled in Maryland by a revolt of Calvinist Protestants against the proprietary colonial magistrate, the Calverts, the descendant of George Calvert, on account of his Catholicism. This Protestant revolt was successful, and the punitive anti-Catholic legislation was tightened, such that the double tax was restored for being Catholic because they did not serve in the militia, even though it was a law. It was the Catholics could not serve in the militia without taking the act of supremacy, which Catholics couldn't do. So the Glorious Revolution ended this experiment of attempting religious toleration until after the Revolution. And so that's the explanation for why Catholics fought with the revolutionaries against the crown, in hopes that the new form of government would institutionalize religious toleration for everyone. As part of the reaction against Catholics in Massachusetts, we have on June 17th, 1700, an act against Jesuits and popish priests in Massachusetts. In 1697, Okay. That's good. James was overthrown in 1688. The next year, 1689, a war erupted in Europe. But the details aren't significant for us, but it lasted for 9 years, or 8. It's called the 9 Years' War, 1689 to 1697, between France on one side and what was called the Grand Alliance on the other side, which included England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Dutch Republic. The war was crippling for all sides, but the peace in 1697, it ended the war, which was the relief for everyone, but it provided no satisfactory settlement to the rival claims to territory in North America. Hostilities never entirely abated, with Protestants certain that Catholics, especially priests, were guilty of inciting Indian tribes in North America to attack the English. So this is the remote background to the French and Indian War in American history. So when the war ended in 1697, Richard Coote, Coote, was the Earl of Belmont. He was named for his father, who committed countless atrocities against Irish Catholics under Cromwell. Earl Coote was appointed governor of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire in the Protestant reaction after the Glorious Revolution. He implemented anti-priest laws in all three, New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, with the Massachusetts version being the broadest, and that's what I got June 17th, 1700. The law is directed against, quote, every Jesuit, seminary priest, missionary, or other spiritual or ecclesiastical person made or ordained by any authority, power, or jurisdiction derived from the Pope or the See of Rome. So it's very long. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just summarize. Section 1 banished all priests from all the provinces, effective September 10th, 1700. Section 2, any priest remaining captured within the borders after September 10th, quote, shall be deemed and accounted an incendiary and disturber of the public peace and safety, and an enemy of the true Christian religion, and shall be adjudged to suffer perpetual imprisonment. If any escaped imprisonment and were recaptured, the penalty is death. Section 3. Every person helping such priest after September 10th, 1700, were to be fined £200. Half of that fine going back to the crown, and half staying in the colony. And they were to be set in the pillory, the stocks, public stocks, to be mocked and ridiculed for 3 days. Skipping down to Section 5. Every justice of the peace was empowered to question anyone suspected of being a priest. And, quote, if such person do not give satisfactory account of himself, he shall be committed to prison in order to a trial. And a reward was offered for any information leading to apprehension of secret priests. Okay. In 1689, 1 year after the War of the Grand Alliance commenced, a French priest, Father Sebastian Rale, R-A-L-E, was a Jesuit, arrived in Canada. Typical of a land in which the church was the established church, French priests naturally regarded the interest of the church and the interest of the French monarchy as identical. Correlatively, the French monarchy routinely used Catholic clergy to further its political objectives. Neither church or state could comprehend the possibility that the French Empire would fall, nor could they regard as anything other than satanic the prospect of losing the French-Canadian Catholic population to the thraldom of English Protestants. And that is, so Father Rale is going to walk right into and suffer in the aftermath of the War of the Grand Alliance, another installment in the continuous dynastic warfare between the successor kingdoms of the Roman Empire. It was triggered by the death of Carl II. He was the Elector Palatine, without an heir. So then because they all intermarry, everybody had a claim on everybody else's throne. If an opportunity, they could always press that claim. So to simplify matters, the Kennebec River extends 170 miles from Moosehead Lake in what is now West Central Maine, south-southeast to the Atlantic Ocean. The French in Canada, then New France, regarded the Kennebec River as the southern border of Acadia, which is northeast Canada. An assertion, of course, rejected by the English colonists in Massachusetts, of which Maine was then a part. Prior to the American Revolution, the two sides fought 6 wars contesting the issue, both sides making use of indigenous tribes, which had aligned with either the English Protestants or the French Catholics. Beginning in 1694, the French monarchy chose to use the church in this conflict. And remember, it's a monarchy, so it's not a free society. And the church had established status. So, if the secular authority tells the church in France that we want some priests to do this, then the church is going to tell the priest to go do this. And so the priest is, in this case, is doubly bound by, obedience to his superior, as well as a French citizen, obedience to the king. So in 1694, the monarchy wished the church to establish 3 Catholic missions in the 3 largest native villages in the disputed region. Norridgewock, near the Kennebec River, Penobscot, on the Penobscot River, and Medoctec, on the St. John River. The French church accepted, as for reasons of, as we said, but also for the higher purpose that this would place them in a position to interact with and hopefully convert the Abenaki and the Penobscot tribes. The problem, well, there are multiple problems with this. The Spanish clergy had their problem in dealing with the Spanish monarchy, who were using the church for political objectives. Here, the French clergy also had problems, but a different set of problems. In this case, the 3 missions, they were not only what the government wanted, was them to found these missions as Catholic colonies, French colonies, in the disputed area. They specifically wanted the priests to convert the indigenous tribes so that the French secular authorities, the military authorities, could then use the warriors of those indigenous tribes as commando units in the ongoing disputes against the English to the south. In south of Acadia would be Massachusetts, then south of Ottawa, would be New York. South of Quebec would be New York. It would be New York, and so forth. And the priests were caught in the middle. As I said, they really were not free, to do exactly what they wished in these situations. So Father Rawl and later Father Leloutre were both entangled in this manner, all the time trying to serve the church, but also, necessity exists, especially when you're, living in a monarchy, which is just a hereditary dictatorship. All right, so with this background, Father Sebastian Rawl founded the first of these Abenaki missions in present-day Maine in 1694, because the French regarded Maine, what is now Maine, as part of Acadia. So this is, the ancestors of the Cajuns. This guy, Father Rawl, was born in the Diocese of Besançon, France, in 1657. He joined the Jesuits in 1675. After his formation and ordination, he was assigned to Canada, arriving in Quebec on the 13th of October, 1689. He was sent to the eastern maritime province of Acadia, where the ancestors of the Cajuns were. The background of which, we already covered that when we covered Champlain. And there, Father Rawl not only learned the Abenaki language, but he also composed a French Abenaki dictionary and a basic grammar text. Owing to his language skill and good relations with the Abenaki, the Jesuits assigned him to establish the first of the missions demanded by the French government in the disputed territory. In 1694, he chose Norridgewock, which is today Old Point, in South Madison in the state of Maine. He chose it because it was at the junction of 2 rivers, the Kennebec and the Sandy Rivers. 7 years later, in 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession opened the arteries of Europe for another round of exsanguination, soon mirrored by a North American counterpart, Queen Anne's War. Father Rawl, as a French citizen and as a Catholic priest in a realm which extended established status to the Church, had to fulfill a double duty, as citizen as well as priest, the way it was understood at the time. He did so by assembling an Abenaki raiding party to attack English settlements on the Massachusetts side of the river in August of 1703. Actually, I should, just to refresh our memories here. So here is the Canada-Maine, disputed border. Down here is Massachusetts. And so all that Maine was considered part of Massachusetts at the time. So here is the Kennebec River, and Penobscot is there. So this is so Acadia. The French Cajuns regarded this as the border, whereas the English Protestants in Massachusetts regarded this as the border. I mean, of course, they wanted to go all the way up to the St. Lawrence River. So this is the territory we're talking about. In 1705, or by 1705, these raids were so effective that the English put a bounty on Father Rawle's life, lay out a hit. A reinforced company of 275 troops attacked Norridgewock in order to capture Father Rawle, bring him back to Boston for public execution. He was warned and escaped, but the English burned the church in Norridgewock as punishment. Father Rawle then led those Abenaki who had followed him in the raids north to the St. Lawrence River for protection. For this, the local French authorities accused him of treachery and cowardice and demanded that the Jesuit superior remove him. Again, they're not free, so the Jesuit obliged and recalled Father Rawle to Quebec. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. But the boundary between Canada and New England, between New France and New England, was not precisely defined, again. So the region that is now Maine continued to be contested. France still claimed it, still demanded loyalty from its colonists and its tribes. But since it lost the war after 1713, did not have the military resources to hold it or to defend it against the English. In 1720, during the interbellum period, meaning the interwar period between the end of the War of the Spanish Succession and the beginning of the French and Indian War, Father Rawle returned to the Kennebec River. He rebuilt the church among the Abenaki and the Penobscot, while a New England minister from Massachusetts, a Protestant minister, named Reverend Joseph Baxter, also went to the Kennebec River to set up a rival mission on Arrowsitch Island among the same tribes. So here we have the Abenaki and the Penobscot, who were caught politically between the French and the English, and now Maine, but now they're going to be caught religiously between, the Catholic priests, missionaries, and Protestant ministers. The Protestant mission was followed by New England stores, and these were followed by an English fort to protect these stores. In July of 1720, the Colonial Council in Massachusetts put a 100-pound bounty for the arrest of Father Rawle, even though the war was over, to bring him to Boston for trial and execution for war crimes. So they wanted to pursue him for what was done during the war that was then over. At the time, there were nobody, took it. There were no bounty hunters willing to try, as the Abenaki still honored and therefore protected Father Rawle. Perversely, the French government demanded that their Canadian colonists eject this English encroachment into Maine, while unable to dispatch any troops to assist. Therefore, Father Rawle, still obedient, used his network among the Abenaki and persuaded them to invite the English to a parley in order to resolve the border dispute. Despite the bounty on his head, Father Rawle joined 250 Indians for the meeting with the English at Arrowsitch Island on July 28, 1721. The Abenaki insisted on the Kennebec River as the boundary of their territory, meaning Maine, quite apart from any French claim or English claim to the area. The English rejected this, declaring that Maine was part of Massachusetts, and that the presence of Father Rall as a Jesuit priest was in violation of English colonial law, which it would have been if Maine really was part of Massachusetts. So while the haggling continued and boredom started to set in, many of the Abenaki went out hunting. Perceiving an opportunity, the English then sent a 100-man hit team to capture Father Rall. He happened to be out hunting with 2 Abenaki and was warned. So somebody went and warned him yet again. And so he and his companions disappeared into the forest. And the English would never find them there. But the English once again burned the church, this time the second church, at Norwich Rock. The flames spread and incinerated most of the Abenaki village next to the church. This triggered what the English called Father Rall's War in January of 1722, because the Abenaki retaliated. So you see, the English burned the Abenaki village, and then the Abenaki attacked him. And who gets the blame? The priest. The Catholic priest gets the blame, Father Rall's War. So the Abenaki retaliated in July of 1722 by attacking an English settlement on the Massachusetts side of the mouth of the Kennebec River. In February and March of 1723, the English nearly captured Rall twice, but each time he managed to elude them. His fall eventually came because of his attachment to the Norwich Rock mission. On August 19th of 1723, he, along with 200 Abenaki, took it back from the English, but it was a trap. Waiting until the Abenaki dispersed, the English attacked and surrounded the village with 1,100 troops against Father Rall with only 40 Abenaki. Knowing that he was the target, Father Rall walked to the center of the village to surrender himself so that the others could escape. The English immediately opened fire and killed him, along with 26 of the fleeing Abenaki. The survivors made it to Quebec, and so that's how the story, survived. In this way, the territory that is now the state of Maine was annexed militarily to the English colony of Massachusetts. Later, in 1833, Bishop Fenwick of Boston dedicated a monument to the memory of Father Rall on the spot where he died. And if you want to look him up, this is Father Sebastian. Its last name is R-A-L-E, Father Rall. For Catholics in eastern Canada, the Acadians, the colonial, the pre-Cajuns, those who did not wish to live under the rule of militant English Calvinists then had to leave Maine. So they moved farther north into the now reduced province of Acadia, the present-day Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The fate of the next generation of French Catholics, Acadian Catholics, can be understood through the experience of another French priest, Father Jean-Louis Leloutre. That's Leloutre. He arrived in Canada 14 years after the assassination of Father Rall, and his life will be covered in due course. But turning for the moment to the Spanish Catholic America, 3 years into the War of the Grand Alliance, 1691, the Spanish governor responsible for the area that is now Texas, his name was Domingo Terán de los Rios, led an expedition into East Texas for the purpose of establishing a stronghold to contain any threat posed from the French in Louisiana. The expedition was accompanied by a priest named Father Damiano Massenet. They adopted the conventional exploration strategy of following rivers, to find its source and just see what was along the way. They reached the headwaters of one such river on the 13th of June, 1691, where Father Massenet celebrated Mass. Because the Mass took place on the feast of St. Anthony of Padua, Rios named the river San Antonio. The location of this river source is currently in the city of San Antonio on the campus of Incarnate Word College. They call it the Blue Hole. Later, mission stations were constructed. There was a mission station there, San Antonio de Valero, which is later the Alamo in American history. The missions of San Jose, Concepcion, San Juan Capistrano, San Francisco de Espada. All were established between 1718 and 1731. Later, the Alamo, that mission was sold to the state of Texas in the 19th century. Today it's a museum. It's across the street from the post office in San Antonio. But all those other missions are still functioning Catholic parishes. Well, with COVID, who knows? But before COVID, they were all functioning Catholic parishes. So next, we go back to French Catholic America and see how Louisiana was developed. So we'll pause there, because this next is going to take some time. We'll meet the brothers, the Lemoyne brothers, Iberville and Bienville, French-Canadian explorers who charted Louisiana, and they would establish the settlements in the northern Gulf Coast, Mobile, Old Biloxi, and New Orleans. So stay tuned. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.